It's time now for à la carte, and I'm joined by France 24's film critic Lisa Nesselson. Good morning, Lisa.
Hello.
A tradition as old as the movies itself came to an end here in Paris last week. A cinema called Le Beverley shut its doors after being run by the same man, Maurice Laroche, for 34 years. Tell us why this matters.
Well, the Beverley on a side street in the second arrondissement was the very last porn cinema in France, not just in Paris, but in the whole country. And you may be thinking, good riddance, who cares? But the Beverley, thanks to the downright courtly Maurice, who sold tickets, ran the projector, did everything, was an almost wholesome outpost showing vintage porn, and by which I mean films shot on celluloid in the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, which, like the porn films of the 19-teens and 20s, are kind of sweet, you know? The bodies are natural, the spirit one of shared pleasure and silly romping, sense of humor. The last thing you think is that the participants were forced into this line of work, which is statistically likely to be the case nowadays, and so makes porn truly obscene. The films, which ran through a real 35mm projector, are falling to pieces, and when they're gone, well, that'll be it for many a tale of a woman borrowing a cup of sugar from the neighbor and getting more than she bargained for, or a monk wandering in the hillsides, coming across two sunbathing young women with whom conversation seems superfluous. That's Mr. Maurice with his collection of 35mm porn films, yes.
Okay. Now, because we live in a Netflix age, if you will, and so much pornography is available online, so I'm told, it's easy to forget that people used to have to seek out sex on film, if you will. VHS tapes were the beginning to the end of the communal experience.
Absolutely. The old Times Square had plenty of porn theaters, as did Paris until about 25 years ago. Now, the tax on regular movies is 17%. They made it 33% on porn, and then that money kept many an art house going because the government redistributed that money. So it was kind of a virtuous circle. The Beverley hosted couples nights on Thursdays and Saturdays.
That's sweet.
And I can only call the atmosphere in the darkened 90-seat theater kind of celebratory. Porn tells us a lot about society. There's an American university whose design department has a carefully curated collection of porn, and that's because such movies were often shot quickly in somebody's apartment, and so using just whatever furnishings were there, and so that's an easy way to study American middle-class furniture.
So they had a storyline, if you will. Now, is it true that the French government collects porn films?
It's absolutely true. And unlike in other countries, here in France, the National Center for Cinema, or CNC, keeps a print of every film released in French cinemas, preserved in a former fort in the Paris suburb of Bois d'Arcy. And a fort is a very good idea for this stuff because films from before the 1950s were shot and printed on nitrate film stock, a close relative to dynamite that can't be extinguished if it catches fire. Dangerous stuff. Bois d'Arcy makes no distinction between masterpieces and commercial flops. If history teaches us anything, it's that stories and films can be reevaluated, and they weren't liked in their own time, and then everyone says, wow. Bois d'Arcy has a large collection of porn films, especially those made between 1977 and 1981, with jaunty titles such as one that translates as "There's a Party in My Anus." Porn is a crucial component of film history. In 1968 in France, a movie called Helga, The Intimate Life of a Young Woman, sold 4.1 million tickets. That was enough to make it the 5th most seen movie of the year. Very few films sell that many tickets nowadays in France. And a French film called Emmanuel, starring Dutch model Sylvia Christel, opened in June of 1974 and ran for 11 years. That's 553 weeks. Wow. I remember squeezing into a sold-out show on the Champs-Élysées with an audience made up almost entirely of foreign tourists. Now the average amount of time a film stays on the screens is 3 weeks. By 1975, erotic films were so profitable that they were showed regularly all over France, and of the 501 films released in 1975, 1/3 were erotic. I think I would have liked to see orgasmic encounters of the third kind. I don't know if friendly aliens were involved.
Now, amateur porn, let's talk about that, because it follows current events closely, doesn't it?
It does, funnily enough. I found out that the most searched for porn titles online the last 3 months have been Gilets jaunes. That's the yellow vest protests that have gotten so much attention. The possibilities are manifold. Protesters wearing the flimsy yellow vests and nothing else. A male motorist who comes up to a roundabout and the female toll taker says, well, he'll have to pay in an unconventional way. When I was in college in the 1970s, there was nothing insulting about going to see a porn movie on a date, even a first date. It was considered a fun thing to do. The weekend movie in the main lecture hall of the university I attended, where an undergraduate degree now costs about $250,000, might be The Devil and Miss Jones or Deep Throat. The pneumatic breasts in Russ Meyer's independently produced semi-porn epics were genuine. The men didn't have gym bodies. The women didn't have fake breasts. The stories were more often silly than sexy, but many people had fun making out in balconies or in cars at drive-ins. So the movies and your early sexual fumbling often went together. Now people are at home, watching a screen. And if you think there's something distasteful about X-rated films, keep in mind that an X-rated film won the Best Picture Oscar in 1968. That was Midnight Cowboy, in 1970, which is a classic that has stood the test of time, a film for grown-ups. One of the hardest things to do is to make a genuinely sexy movie. Porn theaters provided a public service for generations of lonely men and adventurous couples. This French book was just published a week ago by a very serious publishing house that does things about, geopolitical upsets to commemorate the last porn theater. So may the Beverley rest in peace. It's the end of an era.
So do you know what Le Beverley is going to become? Is it going to stay at a cinema house?
No, alas, it isn't. He's sold the space. It'll probably be an office or a little supermarket
or a restaurant.
Something.
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
Lisa, thank you very much for that. Lisa Nesselson there with talking about Le Beverley, the last porn cinema to close in France. That's